Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a massive 5,000-year human speedrun. We're tracing the incredible, relentless momentum of human progress, journeying all the way from floating atoms and early hominids right up to the dawn of the American Revolution. Our goal here is to really understand humanity's non-stop quest for order, power, and meaning by breaking down thousands of years of our shared story. To make sense of all this sprawling history, we're breaking it down into 5 epic chronological eras: dawn of the city builders, the age of antiquity, faith and fractured empires, conquerors, plagues, and kings, and finally, rebirth and revolution.
All right, let's kick things off with Era 1, Dawn of the City Builders. Our story actually begins way back in Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE. Now, this is where we made the monumental shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture, which completely changed the essence of what it means to be human. But get this, it took a bizarre physical toll. You'd naturally think a stable food supply would make us stronger, right? Well, this strenuous new farming lifestyle actually caused the men of the early Sumerian city of Uruk to drastically shrink. They went from being these super athletes, averaging 5'9" as hunter-gatherers, all the way down to a mere 5'3" as landlocked farmers. We essentially traded our peak physical vitality for the security of a cultivated food source. Because of that new food security, populations absolutely boomed. But as population skyrocketed, society needed a way to establish order, and rigid social pyramids started popping up everywhere. Just look at this structure in ancient Egypt. You had every single lower class, from the peasants farming day in and day out, to the artisans and scribes, literally laboring endlessly just to support the immortal pharaoh at the very top. The entire society was engineered to serve one supreme leader who supposedly communicated with the gods.
So you really have to wonder, why on earth would anyone settle for this backbreaking, subordinate life? The answer is twofold. First, pure necessity. It took incredible centralized organization just to feed an empire of that size. But the second piece of the puzzle lies in early philosophies. Over in ancient China, for instance, the teachings of Confucianism and Taoism introduced these deep concepts of societal duty, respect, and aligning with the natural flow of the universe. These philosophies were the glue that made this strict order not just bearable, but a moral imperative.
Moving right along, we hit Era 2, the Age of Antiquity.
This is where things get really interesting, because rising city-states started experimenting with radically different ways to govern their growing populations. They started questioning those old absolute monarchies. It's a stark clash of ideals, especially in ancient Greece. On one hand, you have Sparta. This was a brutal, militaristic oligarchy where, literally from childhood, life was entirely focused on physical strength and war. On the other hand, you have Athens, which was experimenting with this highly complicated, completely chaotic democracy. Athens actually used a machine with tubes and balls to randomly select citizens for their Council of 500. It was messy, sure, but it was absolutely revolutionary.
But hey, not everyone was a fan of this messy Athenian democracy. The famous philosopher Plato actually found it completely barbaric. His logic was pretty straightforward. You wouldn't let a randomly selected person steer a ship, so why would you let them steer a state? Plato argued that only a wise, highly educated philosopher king should hold the reins of power to prevent endless societal troubles.
Despite all those internal debates, these Greek democratic ideals actually survived for one very specific reason. They managed to fend off the massive, autocratic Persian Empire. At the Battle of Marathon, the heavily outnumbered Athenian forces totally crushed the Persians. It was such a monumental victory that it famously inspired a messenger named Phidippides to run exactly 26.2 miles to announce the good news to the city of Athens. And boom, that gave us the world's very first marathon.
Which brings us nicely to Era 3, Faith and Fractured Empires.
So when massive classical empires like Rome and Han China inevitably collapsed, they left these huge power vacuums and widespread chaos in their wake. As leaders and everyday citizens were grappling with this deep instability, the inevitability of death, and widespread suffering, profound spiritual shifts started occurring across the globe. Over in India, a sheltered prince named Siddhartha Gautama stepped outside his palace, witnessed suffering for the very first time, and sought answers. He ultimately achieved enlightenment, becoming the Buddha, and spread a powerful message of inner peace that totally transcended the collapsing political structures of the time.
Meanwhile, over in Europe, the spiritual and political fallout looked very, very different. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire triggered a ripple effect of absolute terror. With no central Roman army around to protect them, populations were sitting ducks for brutal Viking raids. Everyday people were so desperate that they were forced to literally trade their own freedom to local warlords and nobles just to stay alive. This desperate exchange of liberty for protection officially birthed the rigid system of European feudalism.
And that entrenches us right into Era 4, conquerors, plagues, and kings.
This incredibly defensive feudal system essentially set the stage for an age of holy wars. Driven by the Pope, who sat at the absolute supreme top of the European social pyramid, Christian kings launched a relentless, multi-century cycle of crusades. It kicked off in 1095 with a call to arms to capture Jerusalem. Despite some initial success, it sparked centuries of bloody, back-and-forth warfare with brilliant Muslim commanders like Saladin. Ultimately, the Crusades just ended in sheer exhaustion and Christian failure, completely draining Europe of its men and resources.
Now, over in the east, a completely different kind of conqueror emerged. Genghis Khan united the nomadic tribes and used these highly mobile, ruthless terror tactics to carve out the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Japan all the way to the Caspian Sea. His impact was so absolute and his lineage so prolific that an astonishing 8% of modern South Asian men are his direct descendants. That is just mind-blowing. But you know what? The ultimate conqueror of this era wasn't a king, and it wasn't a Khan. It was microscopic. The bubonic plague traveled like wildfire along trade routes, like the Silk Road, wiping out an estimated 75 to 200 million people. But here is the fascinating historical twist. This unimaginable death toll created a massive labor shortage. Suddenly, the serfs and peasants who managed to survive were in incredibly high demand, which essentially forced wealthy landowners to finally grant them better wages and workers' rights.
Reflecting on thousands of years of this bloodshed, rigid feudalism, and absolute monarchies, the Renaissance writer Niccolò Machiavelli absolutely hit the nail on the head. He explained the historical mindset of these empires perfectly. He revealed exactly why oppressed peasants lived in too much dread to ever overthrow their lords. Fear was the glue of civilization. It was the exact same tool that maintained those ancient social pyramids we saw all the way back in ancient Egypt.
All right, our final chapter. Era 5, Rebirth and Revolution.
Listen, fear just couldn't hold forever. Out of the devastation of plagues and holy wars, humanity entered a staggering period of rebirth that fundamentally challenged literally every ancient system of power. In 1453, the map of the world was violently redrawn. For over 1,000 years, the massive walls of Constantinople had protected the remnants of Caesar's Roman Empire. But the Ottomans brought in massive new gunpowder artillery and obliterated those ancient defenses. This singular event shifted global dominance, blocked traditional European trade routes to the east, and forced the entire world into a brand new age.
Because of that huge geopolitical shift, European explorers were pushed to seek new routes by sailing west, which accidentally sparked the Age of Discovery. When explorers like Columbus and Cortez arrived in the Americas, sure, they brought steel and gunpowder, but far more devastatingly, they brought their biology. Centuries of surviving things like the bubonic plague and smallpox gave Europeans a built-up immunity. That immunity unintentionally acted as a biological weapon, utterly wiping out mighty indigenous empires like the Aztecs and the Incas, who had absolutely zero natural defense.
Think about this. For 5,000 years, humanity had basically just submitted to pharaohs, emperors, khans, and the divine right of kings. But that massive historical momentum was finally shattered in 1776. The American Revolution introduced a radical, absolute paradigm shifter onto the world stage. The concept that power does not belong to a philosopher king or a warlord. It belongs equally to the people.
So as we wrap up and look back at this relentless momentum of human history, from those shrinking farmers in Mesopotamia to the democratic experiments of Athens, all the way through the terrors of the plague and the revolutionary ideals of equality, it leaves us with one final haunting question about our own modern civilization. After 5,000 years of empires violently rising and falling, have we finally broken free from the ancient cycle of power and collapse? Or are we simply writing the next chapter before this cycle repeats itself? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.